Ozma of Oz by Frank Baum. 9. The Royal Family of Ev. The Tin Woodman was the first to address the meeting. "To begin with," said he, "word came to our noble and illustrious ruler, Ozma of Oz, that the wife and 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls, of the former king of Ev, by name Evoldo, had been enslaved by the Nome King and are held prisoners in his underground palace. Also, that there was no one in Ev powerful enough to release them. Naturally, our Ozma wished to undertake the adventure of liberating the poor prisoners, but for a long time she could find no way to cross the great desert between the 2 countries. Finally, she went to a friendly sorceress of our land named Glinda the Good, who heard the story and at once presented Ozma a magic carpet, which would continually unroll beneath our feet, and so make a comfortable path for us to cross the desert. As soon as she had received the carpet, our gracious ruler ordered me to assemble our army, which I did. You behold in these bold warriors the pick of all the finest soldiers of Oz, and if we are obliged to fight the Nome King, every officer, as well as the private, will battle fiercely unto death." Then Tick-Tock spoke. "Why should you fight the Nome King?" he asked. "He has done no wrong."
"No wrong?" cried Dorothy. "Isn't it wrong to imprison a queen mother and her 10 children?"
"They were sold to the Nome King by Evoldo," replied Tick-Tock. "It was the king of Ev who did wrong, and when he realized what he had done, he jumped into the sea and drowned himself."
"This is news to me," said Ozma thoughtfully. "I had supposed the Nome King was all to blame in the matter. But in any case, he must be made to liberate the prisoners."
"My uncle Evoldo was a very wicked man," declared the Princess Langwide-Ear. "If he had drowned himself before he sold his family, no one would have cared. But he sold them to the powerful Nome King in exchange for a long life, and afterward destroyed the life by jumping into the sea."
"Then," said Ozma, "he did not get the long life, and the Nome King must give up the prisoners. Where are they confined?"
"No one knows exactly," replied the princess, "for the king, whose name is Raquat of the Rocks, owns a splendid palace underneath the great mountain, which is at the north end of his kingdom, and he has transformed the queen and her children into ornaments and bric-a-brac, with to decorate the rooms."
"I'd like to know," said Dorothy, "who this Nome King is."
"I will tell you," replied Ozma. "He is said to be the ruler of the underground world, and commands the rocks and all that the rocks contain. Under his rule are many thousands of the gnomes, who are queerly shaped but powerful sprites that labor at the furnaces and forges of their king, making gold and silver and other metals which they conceal in the crevices of the rocks, so that those living upon the earth's surface can only find them with great difficulty. Also, they make diamonds and rubies and emeralds, which they hide in the ground, so that the kingdom of the gnomes is wonderfully rich, and all we have of precious stones and silver and gold is what we take from the earth and rocks where the Nome King has hidden them."
"I understand," said
Dorothy, nodding her little head wisely. "For the reason that we often steal his treasures," continued Ozma, "the ruler of the underground world is not fond of those who live upon the earth's surface, and never appears among us. If we wish to see King Raquat of the Rocks, we must visit his own country, where he is all-powerful, and therefore it will be a dangerous undertaking."
"But for the sake of the poor prisoners," said Dorothy, "we ought to do it."
"We shall do it," replied the Scarecrow, "although it requires a lot of courage for me to go near the furnaces of the Nome King, for I am only stuffed with straw, and a single spark of fire might destroy me entirely." "The furnaces may also melt my tin," said the Tin Woodman, "but I am going."
"I can't bear heat,"
remarked the Princess Langwidere, yawning lazily. "So I shall stay at home, but I wish you may have success in your undertaking, for I am heartily tired of ruling this stupid kingdom, and I need more leisure in with which to admire my beautiful heads."
"We do not need you," said Ozma, "for if with the aid of my brave followers I cannot accomplish my purpose, then it would be useless for you to undertake the journey."
"Quite true," sighed the princess. "So, if you'll excuse me, I will now retire to my cabinet. I've worn this head quite a while, and I want to change it for another."
When she had left them, and you may be sure no one was sorry to see her go, Ozma said to Tik-Tok, "Will you join our party?"
"I am the slave of the girl Dorothy, who rescued me from prison," replied the machine. "Where she goes, I will go."
"Oh, I am going with my friends, of course," said Dorothy quickly. "I wouldn't miss the fun for anything. Will you go too, Billina?"
"To be sure," said Billina, in a careless tone. She was smoothing down the feathers of her back and not paying much attention. "Heat is just in her line," remarked the Scarecrow. "If she is nicely roasted, she will be better than ever."
"Then," said Ozma, "we will arrange to start for the Kingdom of Gnomes at daybreak tomorrow, and in the meantime we will rest and prepare ourselves for the journey."
Although Princess Langwidere did not again appear to her guests, the palace servants waiting upon the strangers from Oz and did everything in their power to make the party comfortable. There were many vacant rooms at their disposal, and the brave army of 27 was easily provided for and liberally feasted. The Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger were unharnessed from the chariot and allowed to roam at will throughout the palace, where they nearly frightened the servants into fits, although they did no harm at all. At one time, Dorothy found the little maid Nanda crouching in terror in a corner with the Hungry Tiger standing before her. "You certainly look delicious," the beast was saying. "Will you kindly give me permission to eat you?" "No, no, no!" cried the maid in reply. "Then," said the tiger, yawning frightfully, "please me to get me about 30 pounds of tenderloin steak, cooked rare, with a peck of boiled potatoes on the side, and 5 gallons of ice cream for dessert." I'll do the best I can," said Nanda as she ran away as fast as she could.
"Are you so very hungry?" asked Dorothy in wonder.
"You can hardly imagine the size of my appetite," replied the tiger sadly. "It seems to fill my whole body, from the end of my throat to the tip of my tail. I am very sure the appetite doesn't fit me, and is too large for the size of my body. Some day, when I meet a dentist with a pair of forceps, I'm going to have it pulled."
"What, your tooth?"
asked Dorothy. "No, my appetite," said the Hungry Tiger. The little girl spent most of the afternoon talking with the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman, who related to her all that had taken place in the land of Oz since Dorothy had left it. She was much interested in the story of Ozma, who had been, when a baby, stolen by a wicked old witch and transformed into a boy. She did not know that she had ever been a girl until she was restored to her natural form by a kind sorceress. Then it was found that she was the only child of the former ruler of Oz and was entitled to rule in his place. Ozma had many adventures, however, before she regained her father's throne, and in these she was accompanied by a pumpkin-headed man, a highly magnified and thoroughly educated wogglebug, and a wonderful sawhorse that had been brought to life by means of a magic powder. The Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman had also assisted her, but the Cowardly Lion, who ruled the great forest as the king of beasts, knew nothing of Ozma until she became the reigning princess of Oz. Then he journeyed to the Emerald City to see her,
and on hearing she was about to visit the land of Ev to set free the royal family of that country, the Cowardly Lion begged to go with her, and brought along his friend, the Hungry Tiger, as well. Having heard the story, Dorothy related to them her own adventures, and then went out with her friends to find the sawhorse, which Ozma had caused to be shod with plates of gold so that its legs would not wear out. They came upon the sawhorse standing motionless behind the garden gate, but when Dorothy was introduced to him, he bowed politely and blinked his eyes, which were knots of wood, and wagged his tail, which was only a branch of tree.
"What a remarkable thing to be alive!" exclaimed Dorothy.
"I'm quite in agree with you," replied the sawhorse, in a rough but not unpleasant voice. "A creature like me has no business to live, as we all know, but it was the magic powder that did it, so I cannot justly be blamed."
"Oh, of course not," said Dorothy. "And you seem to be of some use, because I noticed the Scarecrow riding upon your back."
"Oh, yes, I'm of use," returned the sawhorse, "and I never tire, never have to be fed or cared for in any way."
"Are you intelligent?"
asked the girl.
"Not very," said the creature. "It would be foolish to waste intelligence on a common sawhorse where so many professors need it. But I know enough to obey my masters and to get up or whoa when I'm told to, so I'm pretty well satisfied."
That night Dorothy slept in a pleasant little bedchamber next to that occupied by Ozma of Oz, and Billina perched upon the foot of the bed and tucked her head under her wing and slept as soundly in that position as Dorothy upon her soft cushions. But before daybreak, everyone was awake and stirring, and soon the adventurers were eating a hasty breakfast in the great dining room of the palace. Ozma sat at the head of a long table on a raised platform, with Dorothy on her right hand and the Scarecrow on her left. The Scarecrow did not eat, of course, but Ozma placed him near her so that she might ask his advice about the journey while she ate. Lower down the table were the 27 warriors of Oz, and at the end of the room the lion and the tiger were eating out of a kettle that had been placed upon the floor, while Billina fluttered around to pick up any scraps that might be scattered. It did not take long to finish the meal, and then the lion and the tiger were harnessed to the chariot, and the party was ready to start for the Nome King's palace. First rode Ozma, with Dorothy beside her in the golden chariot and holding Billina fast in her arms. Then came the Scarecrow on the sawhorse, with the Tin Woodman and Tick-Tock marching side by side just beside him. After these tramped the army, looking brave and handsome in their splendid uniforms. The generals commanded the colonels, and the colonels commanded the majors, and the majors commanded the captains, and the captains commanded the private, who marched with an air of proud importance because it required so many officers to give him his orders. And so the magnificent procession left the palace and started along the road just as day was breaking, and by the time the sun came out, they had made good progress toward the valley that led to the Nome King's domain. 10. The Giant with the Hammer. The road led for a time through a pretty farm country, and then past a picnic grove that was very inviting. But the procession continued to steadily advance until Billina cried in an abrupt and commanding manner, "Wait! Wait!" Ozma stopped her chariot so suddenly that the Scarecrow's sawhorse nearly ran into it, and the ranks of the army tumbled over one another before they could come to a halt. Immediately, the yellow hen struggled from Dorothy's arms and flew into a clump of bushes by the roadside. "What's the matter?" called the Tin Woodman anxiously.
"Why, Billina wants to lay her egg, that's all,"
said Dorothy. "Lay her egg?" repeated the Tin Woodman in astonishment.
"Yes, she lays one every morning about this time, and it's quite fresh," said the girl.
"But does your foolish old hen suppose that this entire cavalcade, which is bound on an important adventure, is going to stand still while she lays her egg?" inquired the Tin Woodman earnestly.
"What else can we do?" asked the girl. "It's a habit of Billina's, and she can't break herself of it."
"Then she must hurry up," said the Tin Woodman impatiently. No, no, exclaimed the Scarecrow. If she hurries, she may lay scrambled eggs.
That's nonsense, said Dorothy. But Billina won't be long, I'm sure.
So they stood and waited, although all were restless and anxious to proceed. And by the yellow hen came from the bushes, saying, "Cut, cut, caw-caw-dot, cut, caw-cut." What is she doing? Singing her lay? Asked the Scarecrow. "Forward march!" shouted the Tin Woodman, waving his axe, and the procession started just as Dorothy had once more grabbed Billina in her arms.
Isn't anyone going to eat my egg?"
cried the hen in great excitement. "I'll get it," said the Scarecrow, and at his command the Sawhorse pranced into the bushes. The straw man soon found the egg, which he placed in his jacket pocket. The cavalcade, having moved rapidly on, was even then far in advance, but it did not take the Sawhorse long to catch up with it, and presently the Scarecrow was riding in his accustomed place behind Ozma's chariot.
What shall I do with the egg?
"No, what shall I do with the egg?" he asked Dorothy.
I do not know, the girl answered. Perhaps the hungry tiger would like it.
"It would not be enough to fill one of my back teeth," remarked the tiger. "A bushel of them, hard-boiled, might take a little of the edge off my appetite, but one egg isn't good for anything at all that I know of." "No, it wouldn't even make a sponge cake," said the Scarecrow thoughtfully. "The Tin Woodman might carry it with his axe and hatchet, but after all, I may as well keep it myself for a souvenir." So he left it in his pocket. They had now reached that part of the valley that lay between the two high mountains which Dorothy had seen from her tower window. At the far end was the third great mountain, which blocked the valley and was the northern edge of the land of Ev. It was underneath this mountain that the Nome King's palace was said to be, but it would be some time before they reached that place. The path was becoming rocky and difficult for the wheels of the chariot to pass over, and presently a deep gulf appeared at their feet which was too wide for them to leap. So Ozma took a small square of green cloth from her pocket and threw it upon the ground. At once it became the magic carpet, and unrolled itself far enough for all the cavalcade to walk upon. The chariot now advanced, and the green carpet unrolled before it, crossing the gulf on a level with its banks, so that all passed over in safety. "That's easy enough," said the Scarecrow. "I wonder what will happen next." He was not long in making the discovery, for the sides of the mountain came closer together until finally there was but a narrow pass between them, along which Ozma and her party were forced to pass in single file. They now heard a loud and deep thump, 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 which echoed throughout the valley and seemed to grow louder as they advanced. Then, turning a corner of rock, they saw before them a huge form, which towered above the path for more than 100 feet. The form was that of a gigantic man built out of plates of cast iron, and it stood with one foot on either side of the narrow road and swung over its right shoulder an immense iron mallet, with which it constantly pounded the earth. These resounding blows explained the thumping sounds they had heard, for the mallet was much bigger than a barrel, and where it struck the path between the rocky sides of the mountain, it filled all the space through which our travelers would be obliged to pass. Of course, they at once halted, a safe distance away from the terrible iron mallet. The magic carpet would do them no good in this case, for it was only meant to protect them from any dangers upon the ground beneath their feet, and not from dangers that appeared in the air above them. "Wow," said the Cowardly Lion, with a shudder. "It makes me dreadfully nervous to see that big hammer pounding so near my head. One blow would crush me into a doormat." "The Iron Giant is a fine fellow," said Tick-Tock, "and works as steadily as a clock. He was made for the Nome King by Smith and Tinker, who made me, and his duty is to keep folks from finding the underground palace. Is he not a great work of art?"
"Can he think and speak as you do?" asked Ozma, regarding the giant with wondering eyes.
"No," replied the machine. "He is only made to pound the road, and has no thinking or speaking attachment, but he pounds very well, I think." "Too well," observed the Scarecrow. "He is keeping us from going farther. Is there no way to stop his machinery?" "Only the Nome King, who has the key, can do that," answered Tick-Tock.
"Then," said Dorothy anxiously, "what shall we do?"
"Excuse me for a few minutes," said the Scarecrow, "and I will think it over." He retired then to a position in the rear where he turned his painted face to the rocks and began to think. Meantime, the giant continued to raise his iron mallet high in the air and to strike the path terrific blows that echoed through the mountains like the roar of a cannon. Each time the mallet lifted, however, there was a moment when the path beneath the monster was free. And perhaps the Scarecrow had noticed this, for when he came back to the others, he said, "The matter is a very simple one after all. We have but to run under the hammer, one at a time, when it is lifted, and pass to the other side before it falls again." "It'll require quick work if we escape the blow," said the Tin Woodman with a shake of his head. "But it really seems the only thing to be done. Who will make the first attempt?" They looked at one another hesitatingly for a moment. Then the Cowardly Lion, who was trembling like a leaf in the wind, said to them, "I suppose the head of the procession must go first, and that's me. But I'm terribly afraid of the big hammer."
"What will become of me?" asked Ozma. "You might rush under the hammer yourself, but the chariot would surely be crushed."
"We must leave the chariot," said the Scarecrow. "But you two girls can ride upon the backs of the lion and the tiger." So this was decided upon, and Ozma, as soon as the lion was unfastened from the chariot, at once mounted the beast's back and said she was ready.
"Cling fast to his mane," advised Dorothy. "I used to ride him myself, and that's the way I held on."
So Ozma clung fast to the mane, and the lion crouched in the path and eyed the swinging mallet carefully until he knew just the instant it would begin to rise in the air. Then, before anyone thought he was ready, he made a sudden leap straight between the Iron Giant's legs, and before the mallet struck the ground again, the lion and Ozma were safe on the other side. The tiger went next. Dorothy sat upon his back and locked her arms around his striped neck, for he had no mane to cling to. He made the leap straight and true as an arrow from a bow, and ere Dorothy realized it, she was out of danger and standing by Ozma's side. Now came the Scarecrow on the sawhorse, and while they made the dash in safety, they were within a hair's breadth of being caught by the descending hammer. Tick-Tock walked up to the very edge of the spot the hammer struck, and as it was raised for the next blow, he calmly stepped forward and escaped its descent. That was an idea for the Tin Woodman to follow, and he also crossed in safety while the great hammer was in the air. But when it came to the 26 officers and the private, their knees were so weak that they could not walk a step. "In battle we are wonderfully courageous," said one of the generals, "and our foes find us very terrible to face. But war is one thing, and this is another. When it comes to being pounded upon the head by an iron hammer and smashed into pancakes, we naturally object." "Make a run for it," urged the Scarecrow. "Our knees shake so that we cannot run," answered a captain. "If we should try it, we will all certainly be pounded to a jelly." "Well, well," sighed the Cowardly Lion. "I see, friend Tiger, that we must place ourselves in danger to rescue this bold army. Come with me, and we will do the best we can." So Ozma and Dorothy, having already dismounted from their backs, the lion and the tiger leaped back again under the awful hammer, and returned with two generals clinging to their necks. They repeated this daring passage 12 times, when all the officers had been carried beneath the giant's legs and landed safely on the other side. By that time the beasts were very tired, and panted so hard that their tongues hung out of their great mouths.
"But what is to become of the private?" asked Ozma. "Oh, I won't leave him there to guard the chariot,"
said the lion. I'm tired out and won't pass under that mallet again. The officers at once protested that they must have the private with them, else there would be no one for them to command, but neither the lion or the tiger would go after them, and so the Scarecrow sent the sawhorse. Either the wooden horse was careless, or it failed to properly time the descent of the hammer, for the mighty weapon caught it squarely upon its head and thumped it against the ground so powerfully that the private flew off its back high in the air and landed upon one of the giant's cast-iron arms. Here he clung desperately while the arm rose and fell with each one of the rapid strokes. The Scarecrow dashed in to rush his sawhorse and had his left foot smashed by the hammer before he could pull the creature out of danger. They then found that the sawhorse had been badly dazed by the blow, for while the hard wooden knot of which his head was formed could not be crushed by the hammer, both his ears were broken off, and he would be unable to hear a sound until some new ones were made for him. Also, his left knee was cracked and had to be bound up with a string. Billina, having fluttered under the hammer, it now remained only to rescue the private, who was riding under the Iron Giant's arm, high in the air. The Scarecrow lay flat upon the ground and called the man to jump down upon his body, which was soft because it was stuffed with straw. This the private managed to do, waiting until a time when he was nearest to the ground, and then letting himself drop upon the Scarecrow. He accomplished the feat without breaking any bones, and the Scarecrow declared he was not injured in the least. Therefore, the Tin Woodman, having by this time fitted new ears to the sawhorse, the entire party proceeded upon its way, leaving the giant to pound the path behind them. 11. The Nome King. By and by, when they drew near to the mountain that blocked their path and which was the furthermost edge of the kingdom of Ev, the way grew dark and gloomy for the reason that the high peaks on either side shut out the sunshine, and it was very silent too, as there were no birds to sing or squirrels to chatter, the trees being left far behind them and only the bare rocks remaining. Ozma and Dorothy were a little awed by the silence, and all the others were quiet and grave, except the sawhorse, which, as it trotted along with the Scarecrow upon its back, hummed a queer song, of which this was the chorus. Would a wooden horse in a woodland go? Aye, aye, I sigh he would, although, had he not had a wooden head, he'd mount the mountain top instead. But no one paid any attention to this, because they were now close to the Nome King's dominions, and his splendid underground palace could not be very far away. Suddenly they heard a shout of jeering laughter and stopped short. They would have to stop in a minute anyway, for the huge mountain barred their further progress, and the path ran close up to a wall of rock and ended. "Who is that laughing?" asked Ozma. There was no reply, but in the gloom they could see strange forms flit across the face of the rock. Whatever the creations might be, they seemed very like the rock itself, for if they were the color of rocks, and their shapes were as rough and rugged as if they'd been broken away from the side of the mountain. They kept close to the steep cliff facing our friends and glided up and down and this way and that, with a lack of regularity that was quite confusing. And they seemed not to need places to rest their feet, but clung to the surface of the rock as a fly does to a window pane, and were never still for a moment. "Do not mind them," said Tick-Tock, as Dorothy shrank back. "They are only the gnomes." "And what are gnomes?" asked the girl, half frightened. "They are rock fairies, and serve the Nome King," replied the machine. "But they will do us no harm. You must call for the king, because without him you can never find the entrance to the palace." "You call," said Dorothy to Ozma. Just then the gnomes laughed again, and the sound was so weird and disheartening that the 26 officers commanded the private to right about face, and they all started to run as fast as they could. The Tin Woodman at once pursued his army and cried, "Halt! When they'd stopped their flight, he asked, "Where are you going?" I find I've forgotten the brush for my whiskers," said a general, trembling with fear. So we are going back for it." "That is impossible," replied the Tin Woodman, "for the giant with the hammer would kill you all if you tried to pass him."
"Oh, I'd forgotten the giant," said the general, turning pale.
"You seem to forget a good many things," remarked the Tin Woodman. "I hope you won't forget that you are a brave man."
"Never!" cried the general, slapping his gold-embroidered chest.
"Never!" cried all the other officers, indignantly slapping their chests.
"For my part," said the private, meekly, "I must obey my officers, so when I'm told to run, I run. When I'm told to fight, I fight."
"That is right," agreed the Tin Woodman. "And now you must all come back to Ozma and obey her orders. And if you try to run away again, I have to reduce all the 26 officers to privates and make the private your general." This terrible threat so frightened them that they at once returned to where Ozma was standing beside the Cowardly Lion. Then Ozma cried out in a loud voice,
"I demand that the Nome King appear to us."
There was no reply, except that the shifting gnomes upon the mountain laughed in derision. "You must not command the Nome King," said Tik-Tok, "for you do not rule him as you do your own people." So Ozma called again, saying,
"I request the Nome King to appear to us."
Only the mocking laughter replied to her, and the shadowy gnomes continued to flit here and there upon the rocky cliff.
"Try entreaty," said Tik-Tok to Ozma.
"If he will not come at your request, then the Nome King may listen to your pleading." Ozma looked around her proudly.
"Do you wish your ruler to plead with this wicked Nome King?" she asked. "Shall Ozma of Oz humble herself to a creature who lives in an underground kingdom?"
"No!" they all shouted with big voices, and the Scarecrow added, "If he will not come, we will dig him out of his hole like a fox and conquer his stubbornness. But our sweet little ruler must always maintain her dignity, just as I maintain mine."
"I'm not afraid to plead with him," said Dorothy. "I'm only a little girl from Kansas, and we've got more dignity at home than we know what to do with. I'll call the Nome King."
"Do," said the hungry tiger, "and if he makes hash of you, I'll willingly eat you for breakfast tomorrow morning." So Dorothy stepped forward and said,
"Please, Mr. Nome King, come here and see us."
The gnomes started to laugh again, but a low growl came from the mountain, and in a flash they had all vanished from sight and were silent. Then a door in the rock opened, and a voice cried, "Enter!" "Isn't it a trick?" asked the Tin Woodman.
"Never mind," replied Ozma. "We came here to rescue the poor Queen of Ev and her 10 children, and we must run some risks to do so."
"The Nome King is honest and good-natured," said Tik-Tok. "You can trust him to do what is right." So Ozma led the way, hand in hand with Dorothy, and they passed through the arched doorway of rock and entered a long passage which was lighted by jewels set in the walls and having lamps behind them. There was no one to escort them or to show them the way, but all the party pressed through the passage until they came to a round, domed cavern that was grandly furnished. In the center of this room was a throne carved out of a solid boulder of rock, rude and rugged in shape, but glittering with great rubies and diamonds and emeralds on every part of its surface. And upon the throne sat the Nome King. This important monarch of the underground world was a little fat man clothed in gray-brown garments that were the exact color of the rock throne in which he was seated. His bushy hair and flowing beard were also colored like the rocks, and so was his face. He wore no crown of any sort, and his only ornament was a broad, jewel-studded belt that encircled his fat little body. As for his features, they seemed kindly and good-humored, and his eyes were turned merrily upon his visitors as Ozma and Dorothy stood before him with their followers ranged in close order behind him.
Why, he looks just like Santa Claus, only isn't the same color,
whispered Dorothy to her friend. But the Nome King heard the speech, and it made him laugh aloud. He had a red face and a round little belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly, quoth the monarch in a pleasant voice, and they could all see that he really did shake like jelly when he laughed. Both Ozma and Dorothy were much relieved to find the Nome King so jolly, and a minute later he waved his right hand, and the girls each found a cushioned stool at her side. "Sit down, my dears," said the king, "and tell me why you have come all this way to see me, and what I can do to make you happy." While they seated themselves, the Nome King picked up a pipe, and taking a glowing red coal out of his pocket, he placed it in the bowl of the pipe and began puffing out clouds of smoke that curled in rings above his head. Dorothy thought this made the little monarch look more like Santa Claus than ever, but Ozma now began speaking, and everyone listened intently to her words.
"Your Majesty," said she, "I'm the ruler of the land of Oz, and I have come here to ask you to release the good Queen of Ev and her 10 children, whom you have enchanted and hold as your prisoners."
"Oh, no! You are mistaken about that," replied the king. "They are not my prisoners, but my slaves, whom I purchased from the King of Ev."
"But that was wrong," said Ozma.
"According to the laws of Ev, the king can do no wrong," answered the monarch, eyeing a ring of smoke he had just blown from his mouth. "So that he has a perfect right to sell his family to me in exchange for a long life."
"You cheated him, though," declared Dorothy, "for the King of Ev did not have a long life. He jumped into the sea and was drowned."
"That was not my fault," said the Nome King, crossing his leg and smiling contentedly. "I gave him the long life, all right, but he destroyed it."
"Then how could it be a long life?" asked Dorothy.
"Easily enough," was the reply. "Now, suppose, my dear, that I gave you a pretty doll in exchange for a lock of your hair, and that after you had received the doll, you smashed it into pieces and destroyed it. Could you say that I had not given you a pretty doll?"
"No,"
answered Dorothy. "And could you, in fairness, ask me to return you the lock of hair just because you had smashed the doll?"
"No," said Dorothy again.
"Of course not," the Nome King returned. "Nor will I give you the queen and her children because the King of Ev destroyed his long life by jumping into the sea. They belong to me, and I shall keep them."
"But you are treating them cruelly," said Ozma, who was much distressed by the king's refusal.
"In what way?"
he asked. "By making them your slaves," said she.
"Cruelty," remarked the monarch, puffing out wreaths of smoke and watching them float into the air, "is a thing I can't abide. So, as slaves must work hard, and the Queen of Ev and her children were delicate and tender, I transformed them all into articles of ornament and bric-a-brac, and scattered them around various rooms of my palace. Instead of being obliged to labor, they merely decorate my apartments, and I really think I have treated them with great kindness."
"But what a dreadful fate is theirs!" exclaimed Ozma earnestly. "And the kingdom of Ev is in great need of its royal family to govern it. If you'll liberate them and restore them into their proper forms, I will give you 10 ornaments to replace each one you lose."
The Nome King looked grave. "Suppose I refuse?" he asked.
Then, said Ozma firmly, I am here with my friends and my army to conquer your kingdom and oblige you to obey my wishes.
The Nome King laughed until he choked, and he choked until he coughed, and he coughed until his face turned from a grayish-brown to a bright red. Then he wiped his eyes with a rock-colored handkerchief and grew grave again. "You are brave as you are pretty, my dear," he said to Ozma. "But you have little idea of the extent of the task you have undertaken. Come with me for a moment." He arose and took Ozma's hand, leading her to a little door at one side of the room. Then he opened, and they stepped out upon a balcony from whence they obtained a wonderful view of the underground world. A vast cave extended for miles and miles under the mountain, and in every direction were furnaces and forges glowing brightly, and gnomes hammering upon precious metals or polishing gleaming jewels. All around the walls of the cave were thousands of doors of silver and gold built into the solid rock, and those extended in rows far away into the distance, as far as Ozma's eyes could follow them. While the little maid from Oz gazed wonderingly upon the scene, the Nome King uttered a shrill whistle, and at once all the silver and gold doors flew open, and solid ranks of gnome soldiers marched out from every one. So great were their numbers that they quickly filled the immense underground cavern and forced the busy workmen to abandon their tasks. Although this tremendous army consisted of rock-colored gnomes, all squat and fat, they were clothed in glittering armor of polished steel, inlaid with beautiful gems. Upon his brow each wore a brilliant electric light, and they bore sharp spears and swords and battle-axes of solid bronze. It was evident that they were perfectly trained, for they stood in straight rows, rank after rank, with their weapons held erect and true, as if awaiting but the word of command to level them upon their foes. "This," said the Nome King, "is but a small part of my army. No ruler upon earth has ever dared to fight me, and no ruler ever will, for I am too powerful to oppose." He whistled again, and at once the martial array filed through the silver and gold doorways and disappeared, after which the workmen again resumed their labors at the furnaces. Then, sad and discouraged, Ozma of Oz turned to her friends, and the Nome King calmly reseated himself upon the rock throne.
It would be foolish for us to fight, the girl said to the Tin Woodman, for our brave 27 would be quickly destroyed. I'm sure I do not know how to act in this emergency.
"Ask the king where his kitchen is," suggested the tiger. "I'm hungry as a bear." "I might pounce upon the king and tear him to pieces," remarked the cowardly lion. "Try it," said the monarch, lighting his pipe with another hot coal which he took from his pocket. The lion crouched low and tried to spring upon the Nome King, but he hopped only a little way into the air and came down again in the same place, not being able to approach the throne by even an inch. "It seems to me," said the Scarecrow, thoughtfully, "that our best plan is to wheedle His Majesty into giving up his slave, since he is too great a magician to oppose." "This is the most sensible thing any of you have suggested," declared the Nome King. "It is folly to threaten me, but I'm so kind-hearted that I cannot stand coaxing or wheedling. If you really wish to accomplish anything by your journey, my dear Ozma, you must coax me."
"Very well," said Ozma, more cheerfully. "Let us be friends, and talk this over in a friendly manner."
"To be sure," agreed the king, his eyes twinkling merrily.
"I am very anxious," she continued, "to liberate the Queen of Ev and her children, who are now ornaments and bric-a-brac in your Majesty's palace, and to restore them to their people. Tell me, sir, how may this be accomplished?" The king remained thoughtful for a moment, after which he asked,
"Are you willing to take a few chances and risk yourselves in order to set free the people of Ev?"
"Yes, indeed," answered Ozma eagerly.
"Then," said the Nome King, "I will make you this offer. You shall go alone and unattended into my palace and examine carefully all that the rooms contain. Then you shall have permission to touch 11 different objects, pronouncing at the time the word Ev. And if any one of them, or more than one, proves to be the transformation of the Queen of Ev or any of her 10 children, they will instantly be restored to their true forms and may leave my palace and my kingdom in your company without any objection whatever. It is possible for you in this way to free the entire 11. But if you do not guess all the objects correctly, and some of the slaves remain transformed, then each one of your friends and followers may in turn enter the palace and have the same privileges I grant you."
"Oh, thank you. Thank you for this kind offer," said Ozma eagerly.
"I make but one condition," added the Nome King, his eyes twinkling.
"What is it?" she inquired.
"If none of your 11 objects you touch proves to be the transformation of any of the royal family of Ev, then, instead of freeing them, you will yourself become enchanted and transformed into an article of bric-a-brac or an ornament. This is only fair and just, and is the risk you declare you are willing to take."
12. The 11 Guesses. Hearing this condition imposed by the Nome King, Ozma became silent and thoughtful, and all her friends looked at her uneasily.
"Don't you do it!" exclaimed Dorothy. "If you guess wrong, you'll be enslaved yourself."
"But I shall have 11 guesses," answered Ozma. "Surely I'd guess one object in 11 correctly, and if I do, I shall rescue one of the royal family and be safe myself. Then the rest of you may attempt it, and soon we shall be free, all those who are enslaved."
"What if we fail?" inquired the Scarecrow. "I'd look nice as a piece of bric-a-brac, wouldn't I?"
"We must not fail," cried Ozma courageously. "Having come all this distance to free these poor people, it would be weak and cowardly in us to abandon the adventure. Therefore, I will accept the Nome King's offer and go at once into the royal palace."
"Come along, then, my dear," said the king, climbing down from his throne with some difficulty because he was so fat. "I'll show you the way." He approached a wall of the cave and waved his hand. Instantly, an opening appeared, through which Ozma, after a smiling farewell to her friends, boldly passed. She found herself in a splendid hall that was more beautiful and grand than anything she had ever beheld. The ceilings were composed of great arches that rose far above her head, and all the walls and floors were of polished marble, exquisitely tinted in many colors. Thick velvet carpets were on the floor, and heavy silken draperies covered the arches leading to the various rooms of the palace. The furniture was made of rare old woods, richly carved and covered with delicate satins, and the entire palace was lighted by a mysterious rosy glow that seemed to come from no particular place, but flooded each apartment with its soft and pleasing radiance. Ozma passed from one room to another, greatly delighted by all she saw. The lovely palace had no other occupant, for the Nome King had left her at the entrance, which closed behind her, and in all the magnificent rooms there appeared to be no other person. Upon the mantels and on many shelves and brackets and tables were clustered ornaments of every description, seemingly made out of all sorts of metals, glass, china, stones, and marbles. There were vases and figures of men and animals, and graven platters and bowls, and mosaics of precious gems, and many other things. Pictures, too, were on the walls, and the underground palace was quite a museum of rare and curious and costly objects. After her first hasty examination of the rooms, Ozma began to wonder which of all the numerous ornaments they contained were the transformations of the royal family of Ev. There was nothing to guide her, for everything seemed without a spark of life, so she must guess blindly, and for the first time the girl came to realize how dangerous was her task, and how likely she was to lose her own freedom in striving to free others from the bondage of the Nome King. No wonder the cunning monarch laughed good-naturedly with his visitors, when he knew how easily they might be entrapped. But Ozma, having undertaken the venture, would not abandon it. She looked at a silver candelabra that had 10 branches and thought, "This may be the Queen of Ev and her 10 children." So she touched it and uttered aloud the word Ev, as the Nome King had instructed her to do when she guessed, but the candelabra remained as it was before. Then she wandered into another room and touched a china lamb, thinking it might be one of the children she sought. But again she was unsuccessful. 3 guesses, 4 guesses, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 she made, and still not one of them was right. The girl shivered a little and grew pale under the rosy light, for now but one guess remained, and her own fate depended upon the resolve. She resolved not to be hasty, and strolled through all the rooms once more, gazing earnestly upon the various ornaments and trying to decide which she would touch. Finally, in despair, she decided to leave it entirely to chance. She faced the doorway of the room, shut her eyes tightly, and then, thrusting aside the heavy draperies, she advanced blindly with her right arm outstretched before her. Slowly, softly, she crept forward until her hand came into contact with an object upon a small round table. She did not know what it was, but in a low voice she pronounced the word Ev. The rooms were quite empty of life after that. The Nome King had gained a new ornament, for upon the edge of the table rested a pretty grasshopper that seemed to have been formed from a single emerald. It was all that remained of Ozma of Oz. In the throne room, just beyond the palace, the Nome King suddenly looked up and smiled. "Next," he said, in his pleasant voice. Dorothy, the Scarecrow, and the Tin Woodman, who had been sitting in anxious silence, each gave a start of dismay and stared into one another's eyes. "As she failed?" asked Tick-Tock. "So it seems," answered the little monarch cheerfully. "But that is no reason one of you should not succeed. The next may have 12 guesses instead of 11, for there are now 12 persons transformed into ornaments. Well, well, which of you goes next?" "I'll go," said Dorothy. "Not so," replied the Tin Woodman. "As commander of Ozma's army, it's my privilege to follow her and attempt her rescue." "Away you go, then," said the Scarecrow. "But be careful, old friend." "I will," promised the Tin Woodman. Then he followed the Nome King to the entrance to the palace, and the rock closed behind him. 13. The Nome King laughs. In a moment the king returned to his throne and relighted his pipe, and the rest of the little band of adventurers settled themselves for another long wait. They were greatly disheartened by the failure of their girl ruler, and the knowledge that she was now an ornament in the Nome King's palace, a dreadful, creepy place in spite of all of its magnificence. Without their little leader, they did not know what to do next, and each one, down to the trembling private of the army, began to fear he would soon be more ornamental than useful. Suddenly the Nome King began laughing. "Ha ha ha! Hee hee hee! Oh ho ho!" "What happened?" asked the Scarecrow. "Why, your friend, the Tin Woodman, has become the funniest thing you can imagine," replied the kingdom, wiping the tears of merriment from his eyes. "No one would ever believe he could make such an amusing ornament. Next!" They gazed at each other with sinking hearts. One of the generals began to weep dolefully. "What are you crying for?" asked the Scarecrow, indignant at such a display of weakness. "He owed me 6 weeks' back pay," said the general, "and I hate to lose him." "Then you shall go and find him," declared the Scarecrow. "Me?" cried the general, greatly alarmed. "Certainly. It is your duty to follow your commander. March!" "I won't," said the general. "I'd like to, of course, but I just simply won't." The Scarecrow looked inquiringly at the Nome King. "Never mind," said the jolly monarch. "If he doesn't care to enter the palace and make his guesses, I'll throw him into one of my fiery furnaces." "I'll go. Of course I'm going," yelled the general, as quick as scat. "Where's the entrance? Where is it? Let me go at once." So the Nome King escorted him into the palace and again returned to await the result. What the general did, no one can tell, but it was not long before the king called for the next victim, and a colonel was forced to try his fortune. Thus, one after another, all of the 26 officers filed into the palace and made their guesses, and became ornaments. Meantime, the king ordered refreshments to be served to those waiting. And at his command, a rudely shaped gnome entered, bearing a tray. This gnome was not unlike the others that Dorothy had seen, but he wore a heavy gold chain around his neck to show that he was the chief steward of the Nome King, and he assumed an air of much importance, and even told His Majesty not to eat too much cake late at night, or he would be ill. Dorothy, however, was hungry, and she was not afraid of being ill, so she ate several cakes and found them good. And also, she drank a cup of excellent coffee made of richly flavored clay, browned in the furnaces and then ground fine, and found it most refreshing and not at all muddy. Of all the party which had started upon this adventure, the little Kansas girl was now left alone with the Scarecrow, Tick-Tock, and the private for counselors and companions. Of course, the Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger were still there, but they, having also eaten some of the cakes, had gone to sleep at once on one side of the cave, while upon the other side stood the Sawhorse, motionless and silent, as became a mere thing of wood. Billina had quietly walked around and picked up the crumbs of cake which had been scattered, and now, as it was long after bedtime, she tried to find some dark place in which to go to sleep. Presently the hen espied a hollow underneath the king's rocky throne and crept into it unnoticed. She could still hear the chattering of those around her, but it was almost dark underneath the throne, so that soon she had fallen fast asleep. "Next!" called the king, and the private, whose turn it was to enter the fatal palace, shook hands with Dorothy and the Scarecrow and bade them a sorrowful goodbye and passed through the rocky portal. They waited a long time, for the private was in no hurry to become an ornament and made his guesses very slowly. The Nome King, who seemed to know by some magical power all that took place in his beautiful rooms of his palace, grew impatient finally and declared he would sit up no longer. "I love ornaments," said he, "but I can wait until tomorrow to get more of them, so as soon as that stupid private is transformed, we will all go to bed and leave the job to be finished in the morning."
"Is it so very late?" asked Dorothy.
"Why, it is after midnight," said the king, "and that strikes me as being late enough. There is neither night nor day in my kingdom, because it is under the earth's surface, where the sun does not shine. But we have to sleep, just as the same as the upstairs people do, and for my part, I'm going to bed in a few minutes." Indeed, it was not long after this that the private made his last guess. Of course he guessed wrongly, and of course he at once became an ornament. So the king was greatly pleased, and clapped his hands to summon his chief steward. "Show these guests to some of the sleeping apartments," he commanded, "and be quick about it too, for I'm dreadfully sleepy myself."
"You've no business to sit up so late," replied the steward gruffly. "You'll be as cross as a griffin tomorrow morning."
His Majesty made no answer to this remark, and the chief steward led Dorothy through another doorway into a long hall, from which several plain but comfortable sleeping rooms opened. The little girl was given the first room, Scarecrow and Tick-Tock the next, although they never slept, and the Lion and Tiger the third. The Sawhorse hobbled after the steward into a fourth room to stand stiffly in the center of it until morning. Each night was rather a bore to the Scarecrow, Tick-Tock, and the Sawhorse, but they had learned from experience to pass the time patiently and quietly, since all their friends who were made of flesh had to sleep and did not like to be disturbed. When the chief steward had left them alone, the Scarecrow remarked sadly, "I am in great sorrow over the loss of my old comrade, the Tin Woodman. We've had many dangerous adventures together and escaped them all, and now it grieves me to know that he has become an ornament and is lost to me forever." "He was always an ornament to society," said Tick-Tock. "True, but now the Nome King laughs at him and calls him the funniest ornament in all the place. It will hurt my poor friend's pride to be laughed at," continued the Scarecrow sadly. "We will make rather absurd ornaments ourselves tomorrow," observed the machine in his monotonous voice. Just then Dorothy ran into their room in a state of great anxiety, crying,
"Where's Billina? Have you seen Billina? Is she here?"
"No," answered the Scarecrow.
"Then what has become of her?"
asked the girl. "Why, I thought she was with you," said the Scarecrow. "Yet I do not remember seeing the yellow hen since she picked up the crumbs of cake."
"We must have left her where the king's throne is," decided Dorothy,
and at once she turned and ran down the hall to the door through which they had entered. But it was fast closed and locked on the other side, and the heavy slab of rock proved to be so thick that no sound could pass through it. So Dorothy was forced to return to her chamber. The Cowardly Lion struck his head into her room and tried to console the girl for the loss of her feathered friend. "The yellow hen is well able to take care of herself," said he, "so don't worry about her, but try to get all the sleep you can. It has been a long and weary day, and you need rest."
"I'll probably get lots of rest tomorrow when I become an ornament,"
said Dorothy sleepily. But she lay down on the couch, nevertheless, and in spite of all her worries, was soon in the land of dreams. 14. Dorothy tries to be brave. Meantime, the chief steward had returned to the throne where he said to the king,
"You are so a fool to waste so much time upon these people."
"What?" cried his Majesty, in so enraged a voice that it awoke Billina, who was asleep under his throne. "How dare you call me a fool?"
"Because I like to speak the truth," said the steward. "Why didn't you enchant them all at once, instead of allowing them to go one by one into the palace and guess which ornaments are the Queen of Heaven her children?"
"Why, you stupid rascal, it is more fun this way," returned the king. "And it serves to keep me amused for a long time."
"But suppose some of them happen to guess aright," persisted the steward. "Then you would lose your old ornaments and these new ones, too."
"There is no chance of their guessing aright," replied the monarch with a laugh. "How could they know that the Queen of Ev and her family are all ornaments of a royal purple color?"
"But there are no other purple ornaments in the palace," said the steward.
"There are many other colors, however. And the purple ones are scattered throughout the rooms and are of many different shapes and sizes. Take my word for it, steward, they will never think of choosing the purple ornaments." Billina, squatting under her throne, had listened carefully to all this talk, and now chuckled softly to herself as she heard the king disclose his secret.
"Still, you are acting foolishly by running the chance," continued the steward roughly. "And it is still more foolish for you to transform all of those people from Oz into green ornaments."
"I did that because they came from the Emerald City," replied the king, "and I had no green ornaments in my collection until now. I think they will look quite pretty mixed with the others, don't you?" The steward gave an angry grunt.
"Have your own way, since you are the king," he growled. "But if you came to grieve through your carelessness, remember that I told you so. If I wore the magic belt which enables you to work all your transformations and gives you so much other power, I am sure I would make a much wiser and better king than you are."
"Oh, cease your tiresome chatter," commanded the king, getting angry again. "Because you are my chief steward, you have an idea. You can scold me as much as you please. But the very next time you become impudent, I will send you to work in the furnaces and get another gnome to fill your place. Now follow me to my chamber, for I am going to bed. And see that I am awakened early tomorrow morning. I want to enjoy the fun of transforming the rest of these people into ornaments."
"What color will you make the Kansas girl?" asked the steward.
"Gray, I think," said His Majesty.
"And the Scarecrow and the Machine Man?"
"Oh, they will be of solid gold, because they are so ugly in real life." Then the voices died away, and Billina knew that the king and his steward had left the room. She fixed up some of her tail feathers that were not straight, and then tucked her head under her wing again and went to sleep. In the morning, Dorothy and the lion and tiger were given their breakfast in their rooms, and afterward joined the king in his throne room. The tiger complained bitterly that he was half starved, and begged to go into the palace and become an ornament so that he would no longer suffer the pangs of hunger. "Haven't you had your breakfast?" asked the Nome King. "Oh, I had just a bite," replied the beast. "But what good is a bite to a hungry tiger?"
"He ate 17 bowls of porridge, a platter full of fried sausages, 11 loaves of bread, and 21 mince pies," said the steward.
"What more do you want?" demanded the king. "A fat baby. I want a fat baby," said the hungry tiger. "A nice, plump, juicy, tender, fat baby. But, of course, if I had one, my conscience would not allow me to eat it. So I'll have to be an ornament and forget my hunger." "Impossible!" exclaimed the king. "I'll have no clumsy beasts enter my palace to overturn and break all my pretty knickknacks. When the rest of your friends are transformed, you can return to the upper world and go about your business." "As for that, we have no business where our friends are gone," said the lion, "so we do not care much what becomes of us." Dorothy begged to be allowed to go first into the palace, but Tick-Tock firmly maintained that the slave should face danger before the mistress. The Scarecrow agreed with him in that, so the Nome King opened the door for the Machine Man, who tramped into the palace to meet his fate. Then His Majesty returned to his throne and puffed his pipe so contentedly that a small cloud of smoke formed above his head. By and by, he said, "I'm so sorry there are so few of you left. Very soon now my fun will be over, and then for amusement I shall have nothing to do but admire my new ornaments."
"It seems to me," said Dorothy, "that you are not so honest as you pretend to be."
"How's that?" asked the king.
"Why, you made us think it would be easy to guess what ornaments the people of Ev were changed into."
"It is easy," declared the monarch, "if one is a good guesser. But it appears that the members of your party are all poor guessers."
"What is Tick-Tock doing now?" asked the girl uneasily.
"Nothing," replied the king with a frown. "He's standing perfectly still in the middle of a room."
"Oh, I expect he's run down," said Dorothy. "I forgot to wind him up this morning. How many guesses has he made?"
"All that he is allowed, except one," answered the king. "Suppose you go in and wind him up, and you can stay there and make your own guesses."
"All right,"
said Dorothy. "It is my turn next," declared the Scarecrow.
"Well, why don't you want to go away and leave me all alone, do you?" asked the girl. "Besides, if I go now, I can wind up Tick-Tock so that he can make his last guess."
"Very well, then," said the Scarecrow with a sigh. "Run along, little Dorothy, and may good luck go with you." So Dorothy, trying to be brave in spite of all her fears, passed through the doorway into the gorgeous rooms of the palace. The stillness of the place awed her at first, and the child drew short breaths and pressed her hand to her heart, and looked all around with wondering eyes. Yes, it was a beautiful place, but enchantments lurked in every nook and corner, and she had not yet grown accustomed to the wizardries of these fairy countries, so different from the quiet and sensible commonplaces of her own native land. Slowly, she passed through several rooms until she came to Tick-Tock, standing motionless. It really seemed then that she had found a friend in this mysterious palace, so she hastened to wind up the machine man's action and speech and thoughts. "Thank you, Dorothy," were his first words. "I have now one more guess to make."
"Oh, be very careful, Tick-Tock, won't you?" cried the girl.
"Yes, but the Nome King has us in his power, and he has set a trap for us. I fear we are all lost," he answered.
"I fear so, too,"
said Dorothy sadly. "If Smith and Tinker had given me a guessing clock work attachment," continued Tick-Tock, "I might have defied the Nome King, but my thoughts are plain and simple and are not of much use in this case."
"Do the best you can," said Dorothy encouragingly. "And if you fail, I'll watch and see what shape you're changed into."
So Tick-Tock touched a yellow glass vase that had daisies painted on one side, and he spoke at the same time the word Ev. In a flash, the machine man had disappeared, and although the girl looked quickly in every direction, she could not tell which of the many ornaments the room contained had a moment before her faithful friend and servant. So all she could do was to accept the hopeless task set her, and make her guesses and abide by the result.
"It can't hurt very much," she thought, "for I haven't heard any of them scream or cry out, not even the poor officers. Dear me, I wonder if Uncle Henry or Aunt Em will ever know I have become an ornament in the Nome King's palace, and must stand forever and ever in one place and look pretty, except when I'm moved to be dusted. It isn't the way I thought I'd turn out after all, but I suppose it can't be helped."
She walked through all the rooms once more, and examined with care all the objects they contained. But there were so many, they bewildered her, and she decided, after all, as Ozma had done, that it could be only guesswork at best, and that the chances were much against her guessing aright. Timidly, she touched an alabaster bowl and said, "Ev."
That's one failure anyhow, she thought. But how am I to know which thing is enchanted and which is not? Next, she touched the image of a purple kitten that stood on the corner of her mantle, and as she pronounced the word, Ev, the kitten disappeared and a pretty, fair-haired boy stood beside her. At the same time, a bell rang somewhere in the distance, and as Dorothy started back, partly in surprise and partly in joy, the little one exclaimed, "Where am I? Who are you? What has happened to me?" "Well, I declare," said Dorothy, "I've really done it." "Done what?" asked the boy. "Saved myself from becoming an ornament," replied the girl with a laugh, "and saved you from being forever a purple kitten." "A purple kitten?" he repeated. "There is no such thing." "I know," she answered, "but there was, a minute ago. Don't you remember standing on a corner of the mantle?" "Of course not. I'm a Prince of Ev, and my name is Evering," the little one announced proudly. "But my father, the king, sold my mother and all her children to the cruel ruler of the gnomes, and after that I remember nothing at all." "A purple kitten can't be expected to remember Evering," said Dorothy. "But now you're yourself again, and I'm going to try to save some of your brothers and sisters, perhaps your mother as well. So come with me." She seized the child's hand and eagerly hurried here and there, trying to decide which object to choose next. The third guess was another failure, and so was the fourth, and the fifth. Little Evering could not imagine what she was doing, but he trotted along beside her very willingly, for he liked the new companion he'd found. Dorothy's further quest proved unsuccessful, but after her first disappointment was over, the little girl was filled with joy and thankfulness to think that after all she had been able to save one member of the royal family of Ev, and could restore the little prince to his sorrowing country. Now she might return to the terrible Nome King in safety, carrying with her the prize she had won in the person of the fair-haired boy. So she retraced her steps until she found the entrance to the palace, and as she approached, the massive doors of rock opened on their own accord, allowing both Dorothy and Evering to pass the portals and enter the throne room. 15. Billina frightens the Nome King. Now, when Dorothy had entered the palace to make her guesses and the Scarecrow was left with the Nome King, the two sat in moody silence for several minutes. Then the monarch exclaimed, in a tone of satisfaction, "Very good." "Who is very good?" asked the Scarecrow. "The Machine Man. He won't need to be wound up any more, for he has now become a very neat ornament. Very neat indeed." "How about Dorothy?" the Scarecrow inquired. "Oh, she will begin to guess pretty soon," said the king cheerfully, "and then she will join my collection, and it will be your turn." The good Scarecrow was much distressed by the thought that his little friend was about to suffer the fate of Ozma and the rest of their party, but while he sat in gloomy reverie, a shrill voice suddenly crawled, "Cut! Cut! 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 A cut! 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 A cut!" The Nome King nearly jumped off his seat, he was so startled. "Good gracious, what's that?" he yelled. "Why, it's Billina," said the Scarecrow. "What do you mean by making a noise like that?" shouted the king, angrily, as the yellow hen came from under the throne and strutted proudly about the room. "I've got a right to cackle, I guess," replied Billina. "I've just laid my egg." "What? Laid an egg? In my throne room? How dare you do such a thing?" asked the king in a voice of fury. "I lay eggs wherever I happen to be," said the hen, ruffling her feathers and then shaking them into place. "But thunderation! Don't you know that eggs are poison?" roared the king, while his rock-colored eyes struck out in great terror. "Poison? Well, I declare," said Billina indignantly. "I'll have you know all my eggs are warranted strictly fresh and up to date. Poison indeed." "You don't understand," retorted the little monarch nervously. "Eggs belong only to the outside world. To the world on the Earth's surface where you came from. Here in my underground garden, my kingdom, they are rank poison, as I said, and we gnomes can't bear to have them around.
Well, you'll have to bear this one around, declared Billina, for I've laid it.
Where?
asked the king.
Under your throne,
said the hen. The king jumped 3 feet into the air, so anxious was he to get away from the throne.
Take it away! Take it away at once!
He shouted.
I can't,
said Billina.
I haven't any hands.
I'll take the egg, said the Scarecrow. I'm making a collection of Billina's eggs. There's one in my pocket now that she laid yesterday. Hearing this, the monarch hastened to put a good distance between himself and the Scarecrow, who was about to reach under the throne for the egg when the hen suddenly cried,
Stop!
What's wrong? Asked the Scarecrow.
Don't take the egg unless the king will allow me to enter the palace and guess as the others have done,
said Billina.
Pshaw! returned the king. You're only a hen. How could you guess my enchantments?
I could try, I suppose, said Billina, and if I fail, you will have another ornament.
A pretty ornament you'd make, wouldn't you? growled the king. But you shall have your way. It will properly punish you for daring to lay an egg in my presence. After the Scarecrow is enchanted, you shall follow him into the palace. But how will you touch the objects?
With my claws,
said the hen.
And I can speak the word F as plainly as anyone. Also, I must have the right to guess the enchantment of my friends, and to release him if I succeed.
Very well, said the king. You have my promise.
Then,
said Billina to the Scarecrow,
you may get the egg.
He knelt down and reached underneath the throne and found the egg, while he placed in another pocket of his jacket, fearing that if both eggs were in one pocket, they would knock together and get broken. Just then a bell above the throne rang briskly, and the king gave another nervous jump.
Well, well, said he, with a rueful face. The girl has actually done it.
Done what? asked the Scarecrow. She has made one guess that is right,
and broken one of my neatest enchantments. By rickety, it's too bad. I never thought she would do it.
Do I understand that she will now return to us in safety? Inquired the Scarecrow, joyfully wrinkling his painted face into a broad smile.
Of course,
said the king, fretfully pacing up and down the room.
I always keep my promises, no matter how foolish they are. But I shall make an ornament of the yellow hen to replace the one I have just lost.
Perhaps you will, and perhaps you won't,
murmured Billina calmly.
I may surprise you by guessing right.
Guessing right? snapped the king. How could you guess right where your betters have failed, you stupid fowl?
Billina did not care to answer this question, and a moment later the doors flew open and Dorothy entered, leading the little Prince Evering by the hand. The Scarecrow welcomed the girl with a close embrace, and he would have embraced Evering, too, in his delight. But the little prince was shy, and shrank away from the painted Scarecrow because he did not yet know his many excellent qualities. But there was a little time for the friends to talk, because the Scarecrow must now enter the palace. Dorothy's success had greatly encouraged him, and they both hoped he would manage to make at least one correct guess. However, he proved as unfortunate as the others except Dorothy, and although he took a great deal of time to select his objects, not one did the poor Scarecrow guess aright. So he became a solid gold card receiver and The beautiful but terrible palace awaited its next visitor. "It's all over," remarked the king with a sigh of satisfaction. "And it's been a very amusing performance, except for the one good guess the Kansas girl made. I am richer by a great many pretty ornaments."
It's my turn now," said Billina briskly.
"Oh, I had forgotten you," said the king. "But you needn't go if you don't wish to. I will be generous and let you off."
"No, you won't," replied the hen. "I insist upon having my guesses, as you promised."
"Then go ahead, you absurd feathered fool," grumbled the king, and he caused the opening that led to the palace to appear once more.
"Don't go, Billina," said Dorothy earnestly. "It isn't easy to guess those ornaments. Only luck saved me from being one myself. Stay with me, and we'll go back to the land of Ev together. I'm sure this little prince will give us a home."
"Indeed I will,"
said Evering with much dignity.
"Don't worry, my dear,"
cried Billina with a cluck that was meant for a laugh.
"I may not be human, but I'm no fool. If I am a chicken."
"Oh, Billina," said Dorothy, "you haven't been a chicken in a long time. Not since you've been grown up."
"Perhaps that's true," answered Billina thoughtfully. "But if a Kansas farmer sold me to someone, what would he call me? A hen or a chicken?"
"You are not a Kansas farmer, Billina," replied the girl. "And you said—"
"Never mind that, Dorothy. I'm going. I won't say goodbye, because I'm coming back. Keep up your courage, for I'll see you a little later."
Then Billina gave several loud cluck-clucks that seemed to make the fat little king more nervous than ever, and marched through the entrance into the enchanted palace. "I hope I've seen the last of that bird," declared the monarch, seating himself again in his throne and mopping the perspiration from his forehead with his rock-colored handkerchief. "Hens are bothersome enough at their best, but when they can talk, they're simply dreadful."
"Billina's my friend," said Dorothy quietly. "She may not always be exactly polite, but she means well, I'm sure."
16. Purple, green, and gold. The yellow hen, stepping high and with an air of vast importance, walked slowly over the rich velvet carpets of the splendid palace, examining everything she met with her sharp little eyes. Billina had a right to feel important, for she alone shared the Nome King's secret and knew how to tell the others that were transformations from those that had never been alive. She was very sure that her guesses would be correct, but before she began to make them, she was curious to behold all the magnificence of this underground palace, which was perhaps one of the most splendid and beautiful places in all Fairyland. As she went through the room, she counted the purple ornaments, and although some were small and hidden in queer places, Billina spied them all, and found the entire 10 scattered about the various rooms. The green ornaments she did not bother to count, for she thought she could find them all when the time came. Finally, having made a survey of the entire palace and enjoyed its splendor, the yellow hen returned to one of the rooms where she had noticed a large purple footstool. She placed a claw upon this and said, "Ev!" And at once the footstool vanished, and a lovely lady, tall and slender and most beautifully robed, stood before her. The lady's eyes were round with astonishment for a moment, for she could not remember her transformation, nor imagine what had restored her to life.
"Good morning, ma'am," said Billina in her sharp voice. "You're looking quite well, considering your age."
"Who speaks?" demanded the Queen of Ev, drawing herself up proudly.
"Why, my name's Bill, by rights," answered the hen, who was now perched upon the back of a chair. "Although Dorothy has put scallops on it and made it Billina, but the name doesn't matter. I saved you from the Nome King, and you are a slave no longer."
"Then I thank you for this gracious favor,"
said the queen, with a graceful courtesy.
"but my children, tell me, I beg of you, where are my children?"
And she clasped her hands in anxious entreaty.
"Don't worry," advised Billina, pecking at a tiny bug that was crawling over the chair back. "Just at present they are out of mischief and perfectly safe, for they can't even wiggle."
"What mean you, O kindly stranger?"
asked the queen, striving to repress her anxiety.
"They're enchanted," said Billina, "just as you have been. All, that is, except the little fellow Dorothy picked out, and the chances are that they have been good boys and girls for some time, because they couldn't help it."
"Oh, my poor darlings!"
cried the queen, with a sob of anguish.
"Not at all," returned the hen. "Don't let their condition make you unhappy, ma'am, because I'll soon have them crowding round to bother and worry you as naturally as ever. Come with me, if you please, and I'll show you how pretty they look."
She flew down from her perch and walked into the next room, the queen following. As she passed a low table, a small green grasshopper caught her eye, and instantly Billina pounced upon it and snapped it up in her sharp bill, for grasshoppers are a favorite food with hens, and they usually must be caught quickly before they can hop away. It might easily have been the end of Ozma of Oz had she been a real grasshopper instead of an emerald one. But Billina found the grasshopper hard and lifeless, and suspecting it was not good to eat, she quickly dropped it, and instead of letting it slide down her throat.
"I might have known better," she muttered to herself, "for where there is no grass, there can be no live grasshoppers. This is probably one of the king's transformations."
A moment later she approached one of the purple ornaments, and while the queen watched her curiously, the hen broke the Nome King's enchantment, and a sweet-faced girl, whose golden hair fell in a cloud over her shoulders, stood beside them.
"Ivana!"
cried the queen.
"My own Ivana!"
And she clasped the girl to her bosom and covered her face with kisses.
"That's all right," said Billina,
contentedly.
"Am I a good guesser, Mr. Nome King? Well, I guess."
Then she disenchanted another girl, whom the queen addressed as Evrose, and afterwards a boy named Evardo, who was older than his brother Evring. Indeed, the yellow hen kept the good queen exclaiming and embracing for some time, until 5 princesses and 4 princes, all looking very much alike except for the difference in size, stood in a row beside their happy mother. The princesses were named Ivana, Evrose, Evella, Ivarine, and Evedna, while the princes were Evrob, Evington, Evardo, and Everland. Of these, Evardo was the eldest and would inherit his father's throne and be crowned King of Ev when he returned to his own country. He was a grave and quiet youth and would doubtless rule his people wisely and with justice. Billina, having restored all the royal family of Ev to their proper forms, now began to select the green ornaments, which were the transformations of the people of Oz. She had little trouble in finding these, and before long all the 26 officers, as well as the private, were gathered around the yellow hen, joyfully congratulating her upon their release. The 37 people who were now alive in the rooms of the palace knew very well that they owed their freedom to the cleverness of the yellow hen, and they were earnest in thanking her for saving them from the magic of the Nome King.
"Now," said Billina, "I must find Ozma. She is, to be sure, here, somewhere, and of course she is green, being from Oz. So look around, you stupid soldiers, and help me in my search."
For a while, however, they could discover nothing more that was green, but the queen, who had kissed all her 9 children once more, and could now find time to take an interest in what was going on, said to the hen,
"Mayhap, my gentle friend, it is the grasshopper whom you seek."
"Of course, it's the grasshopper," exclaimed Billina. "I declare, I'm nearly as stupid as these brave soldiers. Wait for me, and I'll go back and get it."
So she went into the room where she had seen the grasshopper, and presently Ozma of Oz, as lovely and dainty as ever, entered and approached the Queen of Ev, greeting her as one highborn princess greets another.
"But where are my friends, the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman?"
asked the girl ruler when these courtesies had been exchanged.
I'll hunt them up, replied Billina. The Scarecrow is solid gold, and so is Tick-Tock. But I don't know exactly what the Tin Woodman is, because the Nome King said he'd been transformed into something funny.
Ozma eagerly assisted the hen in her quest, and soon the Scarecrow and the Machine Men, being ornaments of shining gold, were discovered and restored to their accustomed forms. But, search as they might, in no place could they find a funny ornament that might be the transformation of the Tin Woodman.
Only one thing can be done, said Ozma at last, and that is to return to the Nome King and oblige him to tell us what has become of our friend. Perhaps he won't, suggested Billina. He must, returned Ozma firmly. The king has not treated us honestly, for under the mask of fairness and good nature he entrapped us all, and we would have been forever enchanted had not our wise and clever friend, the Yellow Hen, found a way to save us.
The king is a villain, declared the Scarecrow.
His laugh is worse than another man's frown,
said the private, with a shudder. I thought he was honest, but I was mistaken, remarked Tick-Tock. My thoughts are usually correct, but it is Smith and Tinker's fault if they sometimes go wrong or do not work properly.
Smith and Tinker did a very good job of you, said Ozma kindly. I do not think they should be blamed if you are not quite perfect.
Thank you, replied Tick-Tock.
Then,
said Billina, in her brisk little voice,
let us all go back to the Nome King and see what he has to say for himself.
So they started for the entrance, Ozma going first, with the queen of her and her train of little princes and princesses following. Then came Tick-Tock and the Scarecrow, with Billina perched upon his straw-stuffed shoulder. The 27 officers and the private brought up the rear. As they reached the hall, the doors flew open before them, and then they all stopped and stared into the domed cavern with faces of astonishment and dismay. For the room was filled with the mail-clad warriors of the Nome King, rank after rank standing in an orderly array. The electric lights upon their brows gleamed brightly. Their battle axes were poised as if to strike down their foes, yet they remained motionless as statues, awaiting the word of command. And in the center of this terrible army sat the little king upon his throne of rock. But he neither smiled nor laughed. Instead, his face was distorted with rage, the most dreadful to behold. 17. The Scarecrow wins the fight. After Billina had entered the palace, Dorothy and Evering sat down to await the success or failure of her mission, and the Nome King occupied his throne and smoked his long pipe for a while in a cheerful and contented mood. Then the bell above the throne, which sounded whenever an enchantment was broken, began to ring, and the king gave a start of annoyance and exclaimed, "Rockety rickets!" When the bell rang a second time, the king shouted angrily, "Smudge and blazes!" And at a third he screamed in a fury, "Hippocaloric!" which must be a dreadful word, because we don't know what it means. After that, the bell went on ringing time after time, but the king was now so violently enraged that he could not utter a word, but hopped out of his throne and all around the room in a mad frenzy, so that he reminded Dorothy of a jumping jack. The girl was, for her part, filled with joy at every peal of the bell, for it announced the fact that Billina had transformed one more ornament into a living person. Dorothy was also amazed at Billina's success, for she could not imagine how the Yellow Hen was able to guess correctly from all the bewildering number of articles clustered in the rooms of the palace. But after she had counted 10, and the bell continued to ring, she knew that not only the royal family of F, but Ozma and her followers also were being restored to their natural forms, and she was so delighted that the antics of the angry king only made her laugh merrily. Perhaps the little monarch could not be more furious than he was before, but the girl's laughter nearly drove him frantic, and he roared at her like a savage beast. Then, as he found that all his enchantments were likely to be dispelled, and his victims, every one, set free. He suddenly ran to the little door that opened upon the balcony and gave the shrill whistle that summoned his warriors. At once the army filed out of the gold and silver doors in great numbers, and marched up a winding stairs and into the throne room, led by a stern-featured gnome who was their captain. When they had nearly filled the throne room, they formed ranks in the big underground cavern below, and then stood still until they were told what to do next. Dorothy had pressed back to one side of the cavern when the warriors entered, and now she stood, holding little Prince Evering's hand, while the great lion crouched upon one side and the enormous tiger crouched on the other.
"Seize the girl!"
shouted the king to his captain, and a group of warriors sprang to obey. But both the lion and tiger snarled so fiercely and bared their strong, sharp teeth so threateningly that the men drew back in alarm.
"Don't mind them!" cried the Nome King. "They cannot leap beyond the places where they now stand."
"But they can bite those who attempt to touch the girl," said the captain.
"I'll fix that," answered the king. "I'll enchant them again so that they can't open their jaws."
He stepped out of the throne to do this, but just then the sawhorse ran up behind him and gave the fat monarch a powerful kick with both his wooden hind legs.
"Ah! Murder! Treason!"
yelled the king, who had been hurled against several of his warriors and was considerably bruised.
"Who did that?"
"I did," growled the sawhorse viciously. "You let Dorothy alone, or I'll kick you again."
"We'll see about that,"
replied the king, and at once he waved his hand toward the sawhorse and uttered a magical word.
"Aha!" he continued. "Now let us see you move, you wooden mule."
But in spite of the magic, the sawhorse moved. And he moved so quickly toward the king that the fat little man could not get out of his way. Thump! Bang! Came the wooden heels right against his round body, and the king flew into the air and fell upon the head of his captain, who let him drop flat upon the ground.
"Well, well,"
said the king, sitting up and looking surprised.
"Why didn't my magic belt work, I wonder?"
"The creature's made of wood," replied the captain. "Your magic will not work on wood, you know."
"I'd forgotten that,"
said the king, getting up and limping to his throne.
"Very well. Let the girl alone. She can't escape us anyway."
The warriors, who had been rather confused by these incidents, now formed their ranks again, and the sawhorse pranced across the room to Dorothy and took a position beside the hungry tiger. At that moment, the doors that led to the palace flew open, and the people of Ev and the people of Oz were disclosed to view. They paused, astonished at the sight of the warriors and the angry Nome King seated in their midst.
"Surrender!" cried the king in a loud voice. "You are my prisoners."
"Go long," answered Billina from the Scarecrow's shoulder.
"You promised that if I guessed correctly, my friends and I might depart in safety. And you always keep your promises."
"I said you might leave the place in safety, and so you may. But you cannot leave my dominions. You are my prisoners, and I will hurl you all into my underground dungeons, where the volcanic fires glow and the molten lava flows in every direction, and the air is hotter than blue blazes."
"That will be the end of me, all right," said the Scarecrow, sorrowfully. "One small blaze, blue or green, is enough to reduce me to an ash heap."
"Do you surrender?" demanded the king.
Billina whispered something in the Scarecrow's ear that made him smile, and put his hands in his jacket pockets.
"No,"
returned Ozma, boldly answering the king. Then she said to her army,
"Forward, my brave soldiers, and fight for your ruler and yourselves unto death."
Pardon me, most royal Ozma," replied one of her generals. but I find that I and my brother officers all suffer from heart disease, and the slightest excitement might kill us. If we fight, we may get excited. Would it not be well for us to avoid this grave danger?"
"Soldiers should not have heart disease," said Ozma.
Private soldiers are not, I believe, afflicted that way," declared another general, twirling his mustache thoughtfully. "If your Royal Highness desires, we will order our private to attack yonder warriors."
"Do so,"
replied Ozma. "Forward, march!" cried all the generals with one voice. "Forward, march!" yelled the colonels. "Forward, march!" shouted the majors. "Forward, march!" commanded the captains. And at that the private leveled his spear and dashed furiously upon the foe. The captain of the gnomes was so surprised by this sudden onslaught that he forgot to command his warriors to fight, so that the 10 men in the first row, who stood in front of the private's spear, fell over like so many toy soldiers. The spear could not go through their steel armor, however, so the warriors scrambled to their feet again, and by that time the private had knocked over another row of them. Then the captain brought down his battle-axe with such a strong blow that the private's spear was shattered and knocked from his grasp, and he was helpless to fight any longer. The Nome King had left his throne and pressed through his warriors to the front ranks so that he could see what was going on, but as he faced Ozma and her friends the Scarecrow, as if aroused to action by the valor of the private, drew one of Billina's eggs from his right jacket pocket and hurled it straight at the little monarch's head. It struck him squarely in his left eye, where the egg smashed and scattered, as eggs will, and covered his face and hair and beard with its sticky contents. "Help! Help!" screamed the king, clawing with his fingers at the egg in a struggle to remove it. "An egg! An egg! Run for your lives!" shouted the captain of the gnomes in a voice of horror, and how they did run! The warriors fairly tumbled over another in their efforts to escape the fatal poison of that awful egg, and those who could not rush down the winding stair fell off the balcony into the great cavern beneath, knocking over those who stood below them. Even while the king was still yelling for help, his throne room became emptied of every one of his warriors. And before the monarch had managed to clear the egg away from his left eye, the Scarecrow threw the second egg against his right eye, where it smashed and blinded him entirely. The king was unable to flee because he could not see which way to run, so he stood still and howled and shouted and screamed in abject fear. While this was going on, Billina flew over to Dorothy, and perching herself upon the lion's back, the hen whispered eagerly to the girl, "Get his belt! Get the Nome King's belt! It unbuckles in the back. Quick, Dorothy!